Hello and welcome. I'm Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show an average person's reaction to all of the UAP, UFO news from everywhere and anywhere. Today's podcast will be on Charles James Hall. Charles James Hall is the author of a series of books called the Millennial Hospitality Series. There's also a documentary on him called Walking with Tall Whites, none of which I'm competing with. You can see Walking with Tall Whites if you stream it on Amazon or Tubi, for example. I'm simply giving my reaction to his story. I've read all the books in the Millennial series. They were fairly cheap if you download them on your Kindle. And the movie just shed more light, and it showed what type of person Charles James Hall is. He's a very down-to-earth, seemingly honest person. Here's a clip of Charles James Hall giving a summary of what he went through during his time at Nellis Air Force Base.
I'm Charles James Hall. I'm the author of the Millennial Hospitality Series. In the series, I attempted to capture my experiences when I was in the Air Force in the middle 1960s. While I was at Nellis Air Force Base from 65 until 67, I spent more than 2 of those years out on the Nellis gunnery ranges as the range weather observer. I discovered that out on those bases, out on the ranges, there is a base that the Air Force maintains for aliens. And the Air Force maintains the outer perimeter. There is an inner perimeter, which the aliens maintain, and then everything inside the inner perimeter is treated like an alien embassy. The base is in the mountains at the far end of the valley. It's probably 40 miles or so up there. There's 2 mountains up there. The base itself is in the mountain on the east. The alien living area, the living quarters, are underground in the mountains on the west. I wanted to convey to people, especially my children and my grandchildren, how it felt to be the weather observer and to have the aliens come down to where I was and to have to interact with them. Originally, I was part of the rotation pattern. So originally, I was sent up in May of 65 for 6 weeks. The person who replaced me was compromised, and then I was sent to replace him. And in the course of time, the U.S. generals, the American generals, and the aliens formed a committee and decided that they would pick just one observer, and they picked me, and as a committee decision, and that one observer would just be sent all the time and be the range weather observer, win, lose, or draw, no matter what happened. And so therefore, in late 65 and early 66, after the selection process, I was given top secret orders. The orders were that I could go anywhere I wanted out in dreamland. The alien base is actually in Area 54, and the housing area is called Area 53. And dreamland actually, at least at that time, and I presume it's the same as true today, was Area 53, Area 54, and parts of the desert Southwest Game Range. When you're physically at Indian Springs and you're looking up the valley, dreamland includes the mountains on the eastern side of the valley. My orders allowed me to go anywhere I wanted out in dreamland, day or night.
So that was Charles James Hall. Charles James Hall, the author of the Millennial Hospitality Series, detailing his experiences with tall white NHIs or aliens while he was stationed at a weather station in Nellis Air Force Base. And I read the first book and thought it was interesting, although he features himself as a hero throughout, and some of the storylines where he winds up being the hero are repetitive. I was curious enough, though, to continue reading the rest of the series, and even though some of them are take place in different locations other than Nellis Air Force Base, still has the repeated pattern of featuring himself as the hero of stories, always being the smarter, more intelligent one in all his stories. I have to say this, though. He is honest about how scared he was. He did do a good job in the books, at least the first book, of showing what it's like to meet a tall white NHI. And he's honest about showing how intimidated and frightened he is when he meets the white tall aliens. That part rings true. He might have used poetic license when it comes to some of the other stories where he's constantly the hero. Now, mind you, he's a very intelligent person and very adept and very competent in his official role in the military. It just seems as though he's going out of his way to portray himself as a hero. And I know that he was writing this for his grandchildren, but that sort of takes away from the honest portrayal of himself as being intimidated and frightened by the aliens. And speaking of the tall whites, let's take a look at the tall whites. Okay, so Charles James Hall was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada during the 60s. He discovered a base, a secret base, hidden away from the public just beyond the mountains here. The base was a place to protect a race called the Tall White Beings. Only the top generals knew about this location. Here's what they looked like. And after this, on a daily basis, he hung out with these beings, learning about their ways. They could be 500 to 600 years old. They grew until they were 40. After 40, they grew much taller. They could reach heights of about 12 feet. And they were astonished at how Hall could heal because they took very long to heal from, say, like a small thing like a scratch. It would take them about a year to heal from a simple thing like a scratch. So Charles James Hall's story is based on his book series called the Millennial Hospitality Series. And he claims that he was living with extraterrestrials for 2 years. He was scared to death, and he was pretty honest in his books about that. During his first encounters with the tall whites, he was terrified. But after a few months, he overcame his worst fears, and he started to communicate with them and slowly got to know them. So a little background on his story. He enlisted with the Air Force in 1964, and he was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, for over 2 years. While there, he served for extensive periods of time as a weather observer in the desert on the gunnery ranges at Indian Springs, Nevada. And Charles James Hall was quite a competent individual, quite smart. After marrying his wife, Marie, in record time, he earned both a bachelor's degree in thermal physics and a master's degree in applied nuclear physics at San Diego State University in San Diego, California. Charles also did a PhD and did his graduate work at the University of Maine at Bangor. Later, he also earned a master's degree in business administration from Nova Southeastern University at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Now, Charles James Hall began writing his memoirs for his children and his grandchildren. His wife encouraged him to get it published, and she also came up with the name Millennial Hospitality. The book reads like a novel. It doesn't necessarily try to prove the existence of aliens, although he does pinpoint the location of the Tall White's base. And as I read the book and was so curious that I read all of the series in its entirety. The only problem I had with it was that he always seemed to center himself as the hero. Um, he saved the squadron that was flying over the gunnery range at one point that couldn't make its way down. Um, and that same narrative repeats itself not only through the first book, but through the whole series of books, where he does things where he's considered the bravest or the smartest. And I guess, that you can attribute that to him wanting to present himself in a very positive light for his children and his grandchildren. But it takes away from the sincerity and the honesty of the whole narrative. To be fair, though, when he tries to show the reader what it was like being around the tall whites, he's pretty honest with that portrayal. He shows himself as being very afraid and intimidated by them. So that part of the story I certainly bought into. But without a doubt, the Millennial Hospitality series is truly a groundbreaking account of Hall's actual or supposed actual experiences with extraterrestrials in the Nevada desert. I thought that it was significant enough to do a podcast on. He doesn't necessarily try to prove his case. And I'm going to show clips of him in some of his presentations because after writing the book, he became so popular that he went on a lecture series. And he also did the documentary, as I mentioned before, Walking with Tall Whites. And he always comes across as very honest and down to earth. So he's very believable. Anyway, whether or not his account is true about spending 2 years with NHIs in the Nevada desert, he's actually carved himself a nice career as an author and as a speaker. And he is entertaining to listen to, and his books are, if you can get past the repetitive narrative of him being a hero constantly, they are entertaining. In his Millennial Hospitality series, he not only talks about the tall white aliens, but he mentions 3 different aliens that or NHIs that he had contact with. They were the tall whites, of course, that were 2.5 meters tall, the grays with yellow or orange skin in a later book, and also in another book, he also talks about Norwegians with 24 teeth. And that's why he always refers to them as having 24 teeth, because they look pretty much like us or like Nordic looking humans, except instead of having 32 teeth like we are normally coded for, these Norwegian NHIs have only 24 teeth. And they speak English. The interesting part about the tall whites is that they used to like to dress up and go watch shows at Caesar's Palace, which is just outside of Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. He also claims that he observed many alien spacecraft coming and going with families of aliens. Apparently, he stood back on numerous occasions while alien children cautiously took a look around the weather station he worked at. And it's hard to verify whether his claims are true or not, but he says that he was given permission by a U.S. general to share his stories with the world. And apparently a general told him that he had impunity and nothing would happen to him. I also found it interesting that he mentions that the tall white NHIs thought that the whole secrecy thing was funny and unnecessary. It was entirely the generals that kept their existence a secret and forced the secrecy. Although Charles James Hall was allowed to say whatever he wanted to and reveal whatever he wanted to, which is kind of strange. So Charles James Hall was quite bright and he became a nuclear physicist. I thought it was particularly interesting that Charles' first paper describes a photon theory, and it's included in the appendix of one of his Millennial Hospitality series books. It's in the third book called The Road Home, and it's also included in Millennial Hospitality 4, which is entitled After Hours. And the whole photon, the Charles Hall photon theory, named after Charles James Hall, maintains that Einstein's theory fell short, and if scientists accept the hypotheses presented by him, vehicles could be built that could travel faster than the speed of light. I thought I'd show a series of clips of Charles James Hall during a lecture. It'll give you a better sense of the person and his honesty and the way that he comes across. In this first clip, he talks about how he first came across the alien base at Nellis Air Force Base.
I spent more than 2 years out on the gunnery ranges at Indian Springs. They're the Nellis gunnery ranges, and they're served by the Indian Springs Auxiliary Field, which is under the command of the Nellis Base Commander. And during that 2.5 years, or 2+ years, I discovered that there is a base out in Area 54 and Area 53 on the north end of Indian Springs Valley, which the U.S. Air Force maintains for the aliens to use. It is literally an alien base. And I'll come back and talk about that more in subsequent slides. The first question I'd like to answer is, where is Indian Springs, Nevada? This is a map, a topographical map that I was provided by Jerry Zeitlin from his website, openseti.org. Now, I put on those extra blue things, the extra markings. Jerry provided me with a map. And you can see it on his website. Down at the bottom, you'll see is the town of Indian Springs. Notice that the base is north of the highway, but everything south of the highway is not on base. It's just ordinary public land. Notice that when you're actually standing in the town of Indian Springs and looking straight north up the valley, those mountains that I've circled in blue, which are perhaps 40 miles up there, they are, when you look straight north and just a little bit to the east, that's Area 54. And when you look straight north and just a little bit to the west, that's Area 50, is in those mountains in Area 54, just below the tree line. And the alien housing area is in Area 53. You enter them through tunnels. That whole area is inside. Dreamland is that area, Area 54, Area 53, the mountains on the right, and some of the mountains on the left. And I'll get to that more in greater detail. Now, in addition to the area that I've circled in blue, where the main bases are, there are at least 5 or 7 other sub-bases which the aliens only take their scout craft to around the valley. The main base is where the deep spacecraft arrive. Here's a picture taken by Captain David Coote, and I've put on the red markings. The red writing is mine, but this is a picture that Captain David Coote provided for me. Was kind enough to provide for me. And you'll notice off on the right is Dogbone Lake. Okay, that's inside Dreamland. Dreamland includes the western part of the desert Southwest game ranges, where the cover story is that if you're out there and you see something white, pretend it's a bighorn sheep. The aliens, as we'll see in a few slides later, have very large eyes, and when you see them looking at you above the sagebrush, it's easy to mistake them for bighorn sheep, especially if you're terrified, and I speak from direct experience. The red area, where the alien hangar entrance that I've shown in red, in that mountain is the alien hangar entrance. It's physically on a ridge that comes out from the mountain. The ridge comes out to the southeast. You'll notice on the left is the old Range 4 Valley. And in my books, Millennial Hospitality, you'll remember that I refer to the legend of Range 4 Harry. Range 4 Harry, as we'll see, was one of the alien guards. And he had a dry sense of humor, like all of them, as we'll see. And he thought of it as kind of a laughable joke. You know, he's the big hairy monster from Range 4, when in fact he's white and has no hair.
So you can see that he's very specific about where the alien base was. He's actually showing a map there. And I don't think that was shown as specifically in the documentary Walking with Tall Whites. But towards the end of the documentary Walking with Tall Whites, there is a graphic that shows that you could easily Google that location with coordinates that Charles James Hall gave, and there are some round tic-tac-like objects that you'll see on Google Earth if you put in those coordinates that Charles James Hall mentions in the documentary. Here's Charles James Hall describing the tall whites.
Now, people ask me why I never took pictures of the tall whites, and here's a picture of my wife on her wedding day. And and so I'd like to give a physical description of the tall whites. Now, well, you'll see my wife looks white, and she has on her wedding gown, and even makes me float out over the people. Meeting the tall whites was always a very emotional experience, even when I got used to it. It took me more than 6 months to get over the fear of meeting the tall whites. We're naturally afraid of them, and you see those desert valleys are very desolate. Being out there like 20 miles, you know, being 20 miles out from any other human at 3 in the morning when and having anyone step out of the sagebrush would be frightening. When they're not human and they come in groups, my first reaction was one of panic. When I was a weather observer out at the ranges, the entries in my log books went back 7 years. And during that 7-year period, more than 41 weather observers had been sent to the ranges before me. Before I got there, each weather observer in turn would do 6 weeks of temporary duty, and then each weather observer would take his turn going out there. And that had been going on for as long as the ranges were out there. And of course, a weather observer keeps very extensive log books. You keep the daily log, the weather report log, the invoice. Some would be given discharges for, you know, because they couldn't take it anymore. A few had gotten attacked and burned, as I describe in my book. When you're out there and the tall whites come, when you lose your self-control, then if you happen to hit one of the children or one of the tall whites, then they respond the way you and I would respond. It's not pleasant, as I describe in my books. The tall whites have bodies and bones that are thinner than humans. Their skin is as white as a piece of paper. They have larger eyes than humans do. Their eyes are roughly twice the size of our eyes. And when they're young, they're blue and white, just like ours. When you look at them, they look just like people with larger eyes. The eyes spread around the side of their head more than a human's does, and they're very prominent. And their eyesight is as good, at least, as that of a cat. And their hearing is as good as, at least, as that of a dog. They're capable of making sounds with their vocal cords that humans can't hear, just the way that I'm told rhinoceroses can do. But they can hear them, and they're well aware of this. When I was out there among them, it wouldn't be uncommon to apparently hear animal sounds out in the sagebrush, sounds like meadowlarks or dogs barking or horses whinnying. Really, it was the aliens. When they would walk in on me, if they felt like just talking between themselves, they were perfectly capable of talking between themselves using sounds too high for me to hear, and they were well aware of that. So they could stand in a line, say, many times, well, just out of hand reach, if I were brave enough to wait for them to come in that close, and it took months for me to get that brave. And it would appear that they weren't talking at all. But in fact, when you watched them, you could see that they were communicating between each other. Okay? Now, they have much less hair than humans do. They don't have any hair on their arms. The hair in their head is only about half the thickness of our hair, and their hair is naturally so thin that it's transparent, so thin and blonde that it's transparent. Sometimes, if you see them out in the sunlight at a distance and they're wearing their hair short, because it grows just like ours does, it'll look as though they don't have any hair. When they do come in close and you see that they do have hair, they'll look naturally platinum blonde. They, throughout most of their life, they're the same height I am, 5'11". They live 10 times longer than humans, and so a normal adult, a normal alien adult, equivalent to a human 21, 22 years old, would be 200, 250 years old. They live about 700 years, give or take, depending on each individual. And they don't age the way humans age. When they get to be equivalent to a human, 39, 40, in there somewhere, they begin growing again. And then they continue growing periodically. They have several other growth phases, and they get taller. So that throughout most of their life, although they're my height, once they start growing again, they can become very tall before they die. It's not unusual to see older tall whites that are 8.5, 9 feet tall. This is not necessarily helpful for them because their bones and skeletons grow, but their internal organs do not grow in proportion. So as they become taller, they become more frail.
Okay, here's the part where he talks about the tall whites blending in and being able to blend into a casino crowd. Apparently, they like to have fun. And I thought this was interesting because usually don't hear about NHI having fun or being human-like in that sense. These tall whites enjoyed not only dressing fashionably, but also blending in and going out and having fun at the Las Vegas casinos.
The ones that are our height, the young adults, can easily dress up to pass as humans. And when I say easily, I mean from my point of view it seemed easy enough for them to do that. How it appeared from their point of view seemed easy enough for them too, for most of them. In Las Vegas, Nevada, especially in the 60s, you know, on Saturday night, along about 11 o'clock, everybody looks a little weird. Half of them look drunk, you know. You see a lot of tourists there that you wonder which part of the world they came from. Well, under the circumstances, see, for a tall white lady to dress up and put on, and for the men to put on sunglasses, well, in Las Vegas, there were a lot of men walking around with sunglasses after 11 o'clock at night, and you didn't go up and push them, or you'd find out which casino they were protecting, you know. Well, see, it was very easy for them to walk into a casino at 11 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night and dressed as humans and go totally unnoticed. Remember, the tall whites weren't by themselves. They always came as a group with their guards, and they also typically came with a group of human CIA guards. One night I was standing on the corner outside the Four Queens Hotel and Casino in the summer of 1966. When a group of them came through. First, there was a group of 6 CIA guards, 4 men and 2 women, who came through in the wide perimeter, and the wide perimeter being about a half a block in each direction, and took up positions, you know, just inside the casino, looking out the windows. 2 in the Golden Nugget, a man and a woman, 2 across the street in Binion's Club, 1 down the street to the left of me, you know, a couple in the back, and so on. Then the tall whites came through with their guards. And the tall white guards, of course, were dressed like humans. They were male. And then the two women, the teacher and Pamela, came in. And what they were doing was what all tourists do, just enjoying themselves. Well, see, the tall whites, when they came into Las Vegas, they knew perfectly well they were coming into a friendly town. When I was down in the Stardust Hotel and Casino on the Strip, the old Stardust used to have a motif where hanging from the ceiling was fake stars and galaxies and supposedly what it would look like if you were out in space between the stars. The tall whites loved to come in and see that. They thought it was really entertaining because they'd been out between the stars. They said, oh, that's what humans think it looks like, you know. Well, the CIA had kind of established that casino in that area as a friendly part of town. So they had, you know, a pit boss and a team of dealers and a couple of lady CIA guards who would function as Keno girls. And at any time at all, the CIA team could come in and replace the regular pit boss and guards and just be dealing at the table, and or handling the crap table, or watching the showboat across the street, or a casino, and so on, and just making sure that nothing unexpected happened. And then when the tall whites came in, for example, one day when they came in at 4 a.m. on Sunday morning, they were just friends. You know, they were just friendly guys around, so that, you know, if you were to ever try to go up to one of the tall whites, you would discover that the CIA guards would muscle you out, you know, unless they knew, you know, and you could go up there, and of course they knew me in those days, and so, you know, the stories they would tell would be kind of interesting. And although, you know, the CIA guards were never very talkative, you know, they'd always want you to just pretend they were ordinary, you know, and that was kind of hard. The one way I used to pick them out was that because the tall whites are thinner than we are, the one thing they can't disguise is the way they walk. They walk differently than humans. They come from a planet that is much larger than the Earth, has a stronger gravitational field, and when they walk, they naturally, once you get the idea of just standing and looking at a crowd in Las Vegas, as I did, at night, and just watching the crowd silhouetted against some distant lights, you can pick them right out if they're there, because they shuffle when they walk, you know. The gait is just simply different than that of a human, because they don't full stride the way we do and stuff.
Okay, so here in the lecture, Charles James Hall talks about what it's like meeting the tall whites up front.
Meeting the tall whites was always a very emotional experience, even when I knew they were friendly and that they hadn't come to hurt me, because they're not human. Some of the emotions that I used to feel when they came, the first one is that we as humans are naturally afraid of them. Every man I ever met who had seen them always related to the fact, began by saying, I was afraid. My friend in POL, who saw them out at range 4, described, and they had shut down his truck, described how he was so terrified he was going to try to walk back into town from range 4 on a hot summer day, knowing it is impossible, that you'd die in the desert heat, and that he'd gone down into the desert for a mile or so and hidden under the sagebrush until they left. And he used to tell me, the first time he told me that, he was shaking in fear. As you see in my books, when I first encountered them, I was terrified. At first I thought I was dreaming when they came into the barracks at night with American generals with them. The early encounters, which there were many episodes that are not in my 3 books that may be in later books, because in my books I was trying to capture the emotion of how it felt and convey that to the reader. Originally, the book started as an autobiography, and I wanted to capture those emotions and convey it to my children and grandchildren. And then, as you see, my wife said, no, we have to publish this. And the initial emotions were, I found that I couldn't describe them with the spoken word, and that's why I wrote the books, as an attempt to capture that. The initial encounters, I was in my barracks in May of 1965, and at night the American generals with 3 and 4 stars would come through with their alien counterparts, the alien generals, because the tall white society is structured very similar to ours. And when they came through, you know, I thought I was nuts. I thought I was dreaming, you know. When I was sent to Indian Springs, I was never given a briefing. No one ever came to me and said, this is what you're facing. No one ever came to me and said, you're part of a project, and had me sign a piece of paper. No one ever came to me and said, the aliens would like to tell you something. The aliens never wanted to tell me anything. They were perfectly fine. I was an enlisted man. It was perfectly fine with everybody if I was never told. Everything I knew, I had to figure out for myself.
I find that very believable, that the military wouldn't acknowledge what he was going through or acknowledge the NHI presence. As long as they didn't talk about it, they could pretend that it wasn't happening. Nothing was documented. They would just let Charles Hall continue to think he was dreaming or imagining all of this, which it sounds kind of cruel, but it goes along with their policy of need to know. Here, Charles goes on to say that the tall whites were about as afraid of us as we would be of them, which I thought was pretty interesting. You don't normally hear that NHIs are afraid of human beings. The NHIs used him to acclimate the other NHIs to what it's like being around human beings.
Photon theory. I believe I understand the physics of how their craft works. And we'll get to that in a later slide. But meeting them was a very emotional experience. They are naturally as afraid of us as we are of them. Some nights after I got used to the idea that they were real and that they would come around with the men, women, and children, because they have men, women, and children just as we do. And once I got used to that, then it was kind of their turn to be afraid. I remember one night, there were many nights, but one night, for example, after the deep space had arrived at sundown on the night of the full moon as usual, and this was about August 1966 in there. And the tall white guards who were experienced had brought a group of new arrivals down to show them me, what a human looks like. And I know I'm the test human. I'm an enlisted man. If anything goes wrong, they can just cut me down and we haven't missed anything, you know. And the new arrivals have to get used to talking to a human before they can be introduced to quality folk like generals and scientists, you know. So take them out, and if anything goes wrong, well, we'll just cut down Charlie, you know. But nobody's told me that. But I remember it was almost comical because some of them were so afraid of me that they wouldn't come within a quarter mile. They were out in the desert, you know, like, you know, did you see the gorilla? You know, yeah, I saw the gorilla. I'm just out there trying to do my job, right? You know, they have a very dry sense of humor. When you get to know them, they don't have contact sports like we do because they don't have the bodies for it. If they break an arm, it takes their arm 10 times longer to heal up than it does ours. If they scratch themselves, it takes their scratch 10 times longer to heal up than it does you and I. One day I was out there in the morning and I scratched myself, and I was young, and in the most perfectly ordinary fashion, I put on some alcohol and forgot about it. And the next day when they came, the scratch had already healed up. And one of the new arrivals, who was braver than the other, was talking to the guard, and they noted that my scratch had already healed up and asked if all humans were that way. It seemed to be one of the few things that humans did that they found envious. We also multitask mentally in a way that they don't. If they're doing something, they just concentrate on it. So if they're writing, then they're just really focused in on writing. If they're walking, they're focused in on walking. They're surprisingly easy to surprise when they're doing something because they just naturally focus in so well. One night, I was young, and one night I was taking the 4:30 a.m. weather report. As a weather observer, I had to get up Monday through Friday at 3 o'clock in the morning. I bunked by myself in the barracks at Indian Springs. And I had to go out there for get ready and release a balloon for 4:30 a.m. and measure the upper level winds. And as you see in my books, originally I was on my first tour duty. It was 6 weeks of TDY. They sent me back to Nellis. The guy who replaced me got compromised. The tall whites would have killed him, but the generals asked them otherwise, as I describe in book 1. So they sent me as the replacement. Then the guy after me got attacked and burned, so they sent me as the replacement. So then they formed a committee with the tall whites and the American generals, and they decided that they would just pick one weather observer and send him all the time. They picked me. And they gave me special orders, which were secret, and sent me out there.
Okay, so here Hall talks about his orders and the fact that no one ever told him that he would be inspected, and he was never told that had to keep anything to himself. He was actually told that he could tell anyone anything if they were willing to listen, which is very surprising considering the secrecy now and the push against disclosure that's happening now.
A major who wasn't a high enough rank to be told anything. I remember the day he gave me the orders. It was a Sunday. They had me working the day shift at Nellis when no one else is in the weather station. And he had to come in at noon, and the Nellis base commander and the number 2 man had to come in at noon and receive the orders from the Pentagon. And then the 2 guards and a dog had to bring the major over, and he locked the doors. The guards stayed outside, and he began reading me my orders. And he said, Airman Hall, you're cleared to go to Dreamland anytime you want, day or night. And I thought he meant it was okay to sleep on duty. I was so new. What a place, And then when he finished reading the orders, he said, nothing you do will ever be classified. No one can come out and inspect you. No one can ever ask you a question. But you can tell anyone anything you want at any time if they're willing to listen to it, okay? And then I had to sign the paper saying I understood my orders. And
so in this part of the lecture, Charles James Hall talks about how the tall whites handle anger differently than humans do. Apparently, they're very violent, pretty dangerous. I can see why Hall and the other weathermen were afraid of them. So they're not warm and fuzzy type aliens. They are pretty much indifferent to us and don't tolerate any misbehavior from human beings very well.
I could go anywhere, up in all those mountains that we saw on the maps, anytime I wanted, day or night, and I've been up in all those mountains. If I took someone else out with me, I wouldn't have been in any trouble. It's just that the guards would have stopped the truck and said, well, I see you got somebody with you, Charlie, and shot him. Okay, and said, yeah, I wouldn't have been in any trouble at all, but the people who were with me would have been gunned down. The tall whites, going on with the emotions that accompany meeting them, they enjoy having fun. That's why you'd see them in Las Vegas. They got bored as the devil out there in the desert. The women and kids and the young men wanted to come into town and have fun the same way that humans do, because they have emotions just like we do. The only difference is that they handle the emotion of anger differently than we do. And I believe I discussed that in this next slide. When I was a young man, if I met another young man, and we didn't immediately like each other, you might take him aside and say, there's something about you I just don't like. And then you'd beat each other up, and then you'd be friends, You'd have a good fight, and then pretty soon you'd be bonded. The tall whites aren't like that. If they ever become angry with you, they will either just go away, period, and never come back, or they will attack you. And there will never come a time where you and they are friends because now you've fought it out. You're either dead or they're gone. There's no other way. That's the way they are. The mothers love their children. When the tall white mothers came, it was very common for the mother to begin by saying to me, do you understand that we love our children more than human mothers love their children? Or in other words, don't touch my kid or I'll kill you, right? And of course I always, on the other, if they came and they didn't say anything, then it was very common for me to begin the conversation by saying, I understand that you love your children more than human mothers love their children. Or in other words, I'm not going to touch your kid, please don't take it out of me. But I could see them. And then they could come in as close as they wanted. I wouldn't close the distance. I'd just stand there. And they could come in until they felt comfortable. And if they felt like leaving, I would never pursue. If they wanted to leave, if they felt they'd come in too close or they got nervous or something that they felt it was time for them to go, I would never pursue after them. And vice versa, if they were coming in on me and I got nervous because they were getting too close, as in that episode I described in The Wayward Wind, when the alien doctor was coming in on me and it freaked me out, that if I chose to start backing off, they wouldn't pursue. They would just stop and let, until we'd both agreed on a mutual distance. And they kept that meticulously, and of course they expected me to keep that meticulously too. And that's how they are.
In this part of the lecture, Hall talks about the agreement that the tall whites had with the United States Air Force.
The agreement they had with the U.S. Air Force was that nothing I did would ever be classified, that I could tell anyone anytime I wanted. They expect the American generals to keep that to the letter. It isn't anything special about me. It's that once they've made an agreement, that's the agreement. If there weren't something in it for them, they wouldn't make the agreement.
So as far as agreements go, they would only engage in agreements with the United States Air Force if there was something in it for them. So in other words, they weren't here to be benevolent or to help us out out of just a sense of goodness. It was tit for tat, and whenever they gave us something like technology, they would have something given back in return.
Tell us how to build deep spacecraft. The American generals wanted to pick a couple of Air Force officers, for which they were offering me as one of them. They could say, well, we could send him to college and make him an officer. I was an enlisted man at the time. And they wanted to put two of them on the deep spacecraft and send them down to the next stop and see what was down there and then come back and tell them. The alien generals didn't feel that that was in there, they thought that was a waste of time, okay? What they wanted was for the American officers and the alien generals to pick a planet, an Earth-like planet. They said there were several nearby, or around stars that were nearby, and for their version of nearby could be 10 light years, which were too cold for them to colonize. But from their point of view, would be just perfect for humans that weren't otherwise inhabited. But they described them as being similar to, say, Illinois or Wisconsin. The aliens liked it way warmer than we do. And their version was that they would handle the transport, the ships, and that would be in their hands. But once we got there, we'd be in charge of everything on the planet. And all they wanted was for us to build them a base that they could use on their planet, just like they have one here on Earth, and we could do anything we wanted with the rest of the planet. And then they felt that in the course of building that, what they were offering was that whenever our guys needed supplies, they would take them with them to the store, wherever it happened to be, you see. So if our guys needed more supplies, they could either bring them back here to the Earth to get the supplies, or to whatever planet was closest where you could get the appropriate building supplies. And they felt that in that process, humans would learn about their society and they would learn about ours. They thought that was a better deal than merely putting a couple of guys on a spacecraft and telling them to go look at the store.
And if what Hall is saying about there possibly having been talks between the NHI generals and the United States Air Force generals back in the 1960s, that would pretty much corroborate the fact that the Space Force had existed back then, or existed way before present day, and that it could possibly be going outside of our galaxy now. They could possibly have other planets colonized now for the purposes of refueling and maintenance of spaceships. One of the more interesting aspects of Hall's speech during this lecture is that he mentions a few times that the secrecy involved with the NHI phenomenon was not the idea of the tall whites. They thought it was silly. It was actually the United States Air Force generals that imposed the secrecy.
Period. And if they thought that the U.S. Air Force was breaking its agreements by, say, pressuring Charlie, the consequences would be enormous. And it has nothing to do with whether I'm a nice guy or not a nice guy, or whether they like me or didn't like me. It's when you make an agreement with the aliens, can you be trusted? And they didn't have to be long-suffering. Remember, as I describe in my books, each one of them carried those weapons up their sleeve. And if you like the teacher, if an American general were to come up to the teacher, she doesn't have to ask him questions. They wear that electronic communication equipment. They can tell what you're thinking. And if all she's got to do is go see if he did anything that broke the agreement. And if she finds anything in there, she can jerk the equalizer and have him on his knees. I knew a CIA guard once that was terrified of the teacher. He told me that he had been escorting her down the steps of the Capitol building one Sunday afternoon, and that she had been talking with U.S. senators, and she was disguised as a human. And he said because he wasn't familiar with the way they walked, as she was coming down the steps, she was wearing low heels, not high heels, but just, flats, that he thought she was going to trip and fall because he wasn't used to the fact that how they walked up and down steps. He said without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her by the elbow to steady her, the way you would say a lady. And he said she damn near, pardon my language, she almost killed him. She jerked that thing, and before he knew it, she had him down on his knees, giving him the equivalent of 120,000 volts AC, saying, do you think we're fools? Do you think I'd come down these steps if I couldn't take care of myself? And by the time she finished with him, it was nothing but yes ma'am, no ma'am,
So you can see that the tall whites weren't the warm and fuzzy type of NHIs. They were ready and willing and able to commit violence and to put down any human that they thought might threaten them. I'd like to end by talking about how the tall whites weren't in favor of any secrecy in terms of the alien phenomenon or the NHI phenomenon.
So when I say that when you make an agreement with the aliens, you keep it, and the generals will do anything for technology transfer, well, here I am. Remember when I came off the ranges in conclusion, I didn't bring anything with me. I didn't bring any pictures. I didn't bring any diaries. I didn't bring any blueprints. I was never part of anything. I was never shown anything classified. I was never given a briefing. I came off with just my memories, okay? And remember, the aliens, in conclusion, are not in favor of secrecy. It's only the generals that were in favor of secrecy. It was very common for the aliens to remark, the teacher and those people, to remark about how silly the secrecy was. They felt that if they dressed up to look like humans and behaved themselves, they ought to be able to go into Las Vegas and shop for pretty dresses just like anybody else. Okay? Yeah? That lady?
So I thought this was interesting, and I didn't want to in any way reproduce the documentary. Just wanted to give you guys an idea of what Charles James Hall was like, his story, my impression of his books. As I said, he portrays himself as a hero in all his books, but at the same time, he's honest about his reaction and his fear of the NHIs. It's an interesting narrative because he doesn't necessarily portray the NHIs the way that we normally hear them being portrayed. They're here for their own purposes. They're not overly kind, and they can be very violent at times if provoked. And they also like to have fun, and they go into the casinos, dress up, and enjoy themselves. They also are very devoted to their families. They have a family structure, and they love their children very much. So much so that they repeatedly tell Hall that they love their children more than human beings love their own children. They have a similar family structure. The military is structured similarly to ours. And surprisingly, they're not in favor of secrecy. They think that the whole secrecy thing is comical. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I tried to show what wasn't shown in the Walking with Tall Whites documentary. Tried to show a little bit of what Charles James Hall was like during his presentation there. And I thought that it was important that he mentioned that the NHIs, the tall whites, weren't in favor of secrecy, that it was all of the United States Air Force and our government, which I think is pertinent since there's such a pushback with disclosure lately. I'm Al Barrows, and this has been UFO Disclosure. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Let's remember to pray and create a positive shield of protection for all the kids who are lonely and afraid in war-torn countries like Gaza and the Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my podcast.